prelude to the onset of a crisis. According to Kindleberger, although no two speculative manias are identical, they develop along similar lines. Details proliferate, structure abides. The same process was observed in the middle of the 19th century by John Stuart Mill in his Principles of Economics. Some accident which excites expectations of rising prices sets speculators at work. In certain states of the public mind, such examples of rapid increase of fortune call forth numerous imitators, and speculation not only goes much beyond what is justified by the original grounds for expecting a rise of price, but extends itself to articles in which there never was any such ground. These, however, rise like the rest as soon as speculation sets in. At periods of this kind, a great extension of credit takes place. Although Britain remained a predominantly aristocratic and agrarian society in the late 17th century, the stock market boom of the 1690s appears to conform to this speculative paradigm. The projecting age opened with several potential displacements, including the success of Captain Phipps's expedition, which inspired the diving engine companies, the extraordinary profitability of the East India Company and the other great trading companies in the 1680s, the innovations of the financial revolution and the war, which released surplus capital for stock market investment. Positive feedback in the market was also in evidence. According to the poet Aaron Hill, after Phipps's return, the nation displayed a general bias towards enslaving judgment to success. Thereafter, rising share prices attracted new investors from all social classes. The author of Angliae Tutamen observed, "People have been drawn in and abused of all qualities, gentle and simple, wise and otherwise, and really some men of incomparable parts and great qualifications were caught, being allured with the hopes of gaining vast riches by this means." Company promoters took advantage of investor euphoria to float new ventures, many of which were supposedly based on new technologies, but in reality were little more than fraudulent undertakings, intended solely to profit the promoters and stock operators. Shares were given to great men to lend respectability to these ventures. Corruption was evident in the manipulation of share prices and attempts to bribe the legislature. Financial fraud and speculation became so intertwined that many found it difficult to discriminate between them. As with many later stock market booms, including that of the 1990s, the mania of the 1690s played itself out through a series of mini-bubbles, starting with diving schemes and finishing with banks. Shares were driven above their intrinsic values by speculators using financial derivatives, stock options and futures, as well as paper credit. The boom lost momentum after sanguine expectations were disappointed and doubtful enterprises failed. The collapse of share prices contributed to a severe economic crisis. Speculative manias in Kindleberger's model are examined only from an economic viewpoint. Yet social and political attitudes are equally important in determining the course of a mania. According to the financial journalist Alexander Dana Noyes, the American stock market boom at the beginning of the 20th century was as much a social and psychological phenomenon as a financial episode. The same words could be applied to any other period of speculative euphoria. We can supplement the economic model of speculation with two conditions, one social and the other political. The first being that self-interest should be the principal economic motivation, since manias are less likely when society has other priorities. The spirit of gain was the guiding light of company projectors, stock jobbers, whom Defoe accused of unbounded avarice, and other moneyed men of the 1690s. In Angliae Tutamen, the outburst of speculation was attributed to the character of the English nation, which runs a madding after new inventions, whims, and projects. And this unhappy ingredient my dear countrymen have in their tempers. They are violent, and prosecute their projects eagerly for a time, but not meeting with success, they give over, and abandon all hopes of ever doing good. The same speculative temperament had been observed earlier in the Dutch Republic and was found later in the United States. Nations that exhibit an appetite for enterprise and risk-taking have a strong propensity to speculation. The second condition is political, namely that speculation should be unchecked by government interference. In the economic thought of the 1690s, we find the early stirrings of a free market ideology which both anticipated and influenced the later work of Adam Smith. Although William of Orange did not subscribe to this new liberal ideology, he was beholden to the moneyed men who espoused it. In any event, the war with France distracted the government from fulfilling its traditional role as an economic regulator. An economic historian of the period describes the British authorities as following the negative laissez-faire policy of a disorderly political body. The government's failure to regulate or supervise the new stock market and its stimulation of a lottery fever were key factors in the genesis and development of the 1690s boom. This was supplemented by the venality of members of Parliament, who were more interested in profiting personally from the stock market than in opposing its excesses. As we shall see, a combination of laissez-faire and political corruption is a common feature of later manias, the most notable example being the Japanese bubble economy of the 1980s. When the boom ended and was followed by an economic crisis, the political situation changed. The selfish and short-sighted behaviour of stock jobbers and promoters suggested a limit to the economic role of self-interest, and laissez-faire was replaced by regulation of both trade and the stock market. Other manias have also been followed by a wave of popular, if rather hypocritical, revulsion against greed. After the crisis of 1696, stock jobbers became a symbol for the avarice of society at large, just as the moneylenders, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's phrase, were castigated in the 1930s. It is easier to observe the common traits of a speculative mania as they emerged in the 1690s than it is to explain why the pattern should have established itself so early in such an enduring form. While Kindleberger produces a convincing model for what he calls the hardy perennial of the speculative mania, he does not seek to explain why speculation has changed so little from its earliest appearance to the present day. Despite great trumpeting of the level of financial sophistication reached in the late 20th century, there is really very little in our financial understanding that is actually new. Already in the 17th century, both in Amsterdam and in London, we find financial derivatives being used for both risk control and speculation. We also find sophisticated notions of value, together with the idea of discounted cash flows and present values. Wagering and probability theory provided contemporaries with an understanding that the risk-reward ratio could, in certain circumstances, be calculated. Defoe warned against buying shares above their intrinsic value, while Sir Richard Steele elaborated a contrarian investment strategy involving the suppression of hope and fear. Taken together, their advice more or less anticipates the value investor approach of Benjamin Graham, the 20th century's so-called father of securities analysis. If investor perceptions and behaviour have not changed significantly in 300 years, it is natural that speculation should also retain its original qualities. The modern investor is just as liable to be whipped up into a frenzy over companies introducing a new technology as the diving engine cullies of the projecting age. According to the financial journalist and historian James Grant, progress is cumulative in science and engineering, but cyclical in finance. It is often said that speculation never changes because human nature remains the same. Avarice, or desire of gain, is a universal passion which operates at all times, in all places, and upon all persons, wrote David Hume in the 18th century. To this we might add that the fear of loss, emulation of one's neighbour, the credulity of the crowd, and the psychology of gambling are equally universal. The early stock markets were moved by hopes and fears as much as their later counterparts. These emotions are unleashed during moments of speculative euphoria. They follow the path of least resistance, moulding each mania, regardless of its historical context, into a common form. This explains why all great speculative events seem to repeat themselves, and why the experience of the 1690s seems so familiar. Chapter 3. The never-to-be-forgot or forgiven South Sea Scheme. There must certainly be a vast fund of stupidity in human nature, else men would not be caught as they are 1,000 times over by the same snare, and while they yet remember their past misfortunes, go on to court and encourage the causes to which they were owing, and which will again produce them. Cato's Letters, January 1721. All Europe, as well as these kingdoms, are on the point of being delivered by the influence of British arms and councils. So far as prudence can foretell, the unanimity of this session of Parliament must establish, with the peace of all Europe, the glory and trade of these kingdoms on a lasting foundation. I think every man may see the end of our labours. All I have to ask of you is that you will agree to be a great and flourishing people. Thus ran the King's speech at the opening of Parliament on the 23rd of November 1719. This hopeful rhetoric appeared well justified. The invasion force of the Old Pretender, son of James II, had recently been crushed at Glenshiel in the Highlands, and the old Tory leadership was in exile in Paris, leaving George I and his Whig cronies to contemplate a future in which their power lay unchallenged. The accession of the Hanoverian dynasty in 1714, and the peace with France that followed, had given great satisfaction to the moneyed men, who recommenced trading with new vigour. Interest rates were low, and the king's anticipation that his people would be great and flourishing seemed no idle boast. Only the author of Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, failed to share in the widespread jubilation. In his Anatomy of Exchange Alley, Defoe warned of a general visitation where all distempers are swallowed up in the plague like a common calamity that makes enemies turn friends and drowns lesser grievance in the general deluge. But what did the rant of an undischarged bankrupt count for against the combined wisdom of the court, Parliament, and city? Within a year Defoe was vindicated. A calamity, popularly perceived as the biblical visitation anticipated by Defoe, had shaken the kingdom root and branch. The prosperity, so recently in evidence, had disappeared, to be replaced by bankruptcies and suicides. The ministry was in disarray, Parliament unruly, and riotous crowds thronged Westminster, jeering at ministers and baying for blood. The new dynasty was shaken. A member of Parliament claimed that, had the Old Pretender chosen to invade at this moment, he could have ridden to Westminster unopposed. Such a dramatic revolution in political and commercial fortunes had never before been witnessed in the country, despite its history of civil wars and usurpations. The cause of this great bouleversement was known to all. It was described by the two monosyllables which resounded from every lip. The nation was submerged under the waves of the South Sea. The First Bubbles. Since the 1690s, the momentum of the financial revolution had continued with a number of important innovations. In 1710 there had been a brief boom following the successful flotation of Sunfire, the first insurance company. A year later, the South Sea Company was established to take over £10 million of government debt, which it converted into its own shares. In exchange, the South Sea Company received an annual interest payment from the government and the monopoly of trade with the Spanish colonies in South America. A couple of years later, the company received exclusive rights to sell slaves in South America. Although its trading activities always showed a loss, the South Sea Company succeeded as a financial institution. In early 1719, it took over a further £1,700,000 of government debt in the form of annuities, which it converted into South Sea stock. By this date, the ideology of self-interest had recovered from the battering it had received after the crisis of the mid-1690s. It was most famously articulated in Bernard Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees, with its thesis that private vices, avarice, prodigality, pride, and luxury, produced public benefits. The lust for gain remained most rampant in the coffee-houses of Exchange Alley. In her play, A Bold Stroke for a Wife, 1718, Susanna Centlivre, the dramatist's spouse of the royal cook, portrayed the alley as a place where bulls contested with bears, brokers bit, that is, cheated, their customers, and false rumours were deliberately circulated. A few years earlier, in January 1714, the notorious Queen Anne is dead rumour had caused shares to slide, yet when the Queen actually died a few months later, the market took the news in its stride. The year 1719 was one of general prosperity and confidence. In France, the Scotsman John Law, perhaps the greatest financier of all time, was putting the finishing touches to his system. His Mississippi Company controlled French Louisiana, including half the territory of the United States, the French East India and China companies, the tobacco monopoly, the mint, the tax farms, the National Bank, La Banque Royale, and in August 1719 it took over the entire French national debt of 1,500 million livres. The system, which also involved substituting a paper currency for gold, was the most far-reaching economic experiment undertaken before the Russian Revolution. The son of an Edinburgh goldsmith, Law regarded money as a medium of exchange rather than a store of intrinsic value. His broad, indeed revolutionary conception of money included paper currency, bonds, credit notes, and company shares. Following the example of the Darien Company in the 1690s, Law's bank issued increasing amounts of paper currency to provide loans for the purchase of shares. As the Mississippi shares rose in value, more money was printed, producing an inflationary spiral, which pushed the share price from under 500 livres at the launch of the system to over 20,000 by late 1719. The effect of Law's machinations was to produce an unprecedented outburst of speculation in France, where new fortunes brought the word millionaire into usage. Investors converged on the Parisian stock market in the Rue Quincampoix from every corner of Europe. In Geneva, house prices began to rise after its citizens cashed in their Mississippi profits. In Hamburg, new insurance companies were floated, and in Austria, an Eastern trading company was proposed. Europe was experiencing the first international bull market. By autumn, the speculative fever had reached London, where new companies were appearing in Exchange Alley. As speculative funds flowed from London to Paris, the Whig ministry agonized on the success of Law's project, fearing it would lead to French supremacy on the continent and eventual war with Britain. Something needed to be done. If France's greatest company was named after a river, they already had a company named after an ocean. The South Sea Company would serve as an English Mississippi. The South Sea Scheme. The scheme, in its essentials, was relatively modest in comparison to its French counterpart. The directors of the South Sea Company proposed to take over, or privatize, the British national debt, comprising various annuities, which it agreed to convert into its own shares. In return, the company would receive from the government an interest payment on the debt. There were numerous precedents for the scheme. What was different was the scale of the operation, since the annuities were capitalized by the government at over £30 million. Since the holders of government annuities could not be coerced into converting their assets into South Sea stock, the company had to make them an attractive offer. If it could inflate the value of its shares, which were already trading at a premium, it could offer a good price to the annuitants. The company was allowed to issue shares with a nominal value of £31.5 million. As the share's nominal value was £100, This implied a maximum issue of 315,000 new shares. Those shares authorised for issue but not involved in the conversion could be sold in the market, and the money raised used to pay the £7.5 million the company had agreed to give the government for the privilege of taking over its debt. Any proceeds that remained were considered a profit to the company. The success of the scheme, therefore, depended on inflating the value of South Sea stock prior to the conversion, so that fewer shares were actually exchanged for annuities. These arrangements were as confusing to most contemporaries as they appear to the modern listener. It is possible to clarify them by explaining how the conversion would work at different levels of the South Sea share price. If the share price was at its £100 nominal value, and all the annuitants accepted the conversion, then 315,000 new South Sea shares would be created. The annuitants would receive a smaller income, since in its deal with the South Sea Company the government had arranged to reduce the total interest payment on its debt by £500,000, but in exchange they would at least have a tradable security with a 5% yield. In this case, however, there would be no surplus for the company to pay the government its £7.5 million sweetener, nor would it have any shares remaining to sell for its own profit. Now, assume the share price was £200, and every annuitant accepted conversion. Only half the number of authorised shares need be offered for the conversion, leaving the remainder to be sold in the market for £31 million. This would cover the cost of the payment to the government and leave a large cash surplus for the company's shareholders. The principle of the scheme was essentially quite simple. The higher the share price, the greater the profit for the company. What the company actually did was rather more complicated. It raised its share price and then offered the annuitants shares with a market value greater than the original terms of conversion, although the nominal value of the shares they received was actually smaller. This provided the annuitants with a quick capital profit if they accepted conversion. The details of the South Sea scheme are difficult to bear in mind, and for the sake of simplicity it is well to remember two facts. 1. The higher the South Sea share price, the fewer shares were exchanged for annuities, and the greater the profit to be divided between the company and the government. 2. The higher the value of the South Sea shares, the greater the market value of the shares received by the annuitants upon conversion. All parties, annuitants, government, existing and prospective shareholders, had an interest in an inflated share price. No sooner had the scheme been announced to Parliament by Sir John Ailerby, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, on the 21st of January 1720, than the price of the South Sea shares began to rise. By mid-February it had reached 187, up from 128 at the start of the year. In Mist's journal, Daniel Defoe reported that Exchange Alley was teeming with people from all over town. The South Sea had become the English Mississippi. "Where must this fall at last?" he asked with his customary prescience. "If new shares are created to make this purchase of annuities, which shares are vendible at double the intrinsic value, where must it fall when the price abates, and when what is bought for 200 may sell but at par?" The public's avidity for South Sea stock had appeared before the company had received permission from Parliament to go ahead with the conversion, and before it had announced the terms of the conversion to the annuitants. The carefree spirit which characterized the South Sea speculator is revealed in a frank letter that the poet Alexander Pope sent to his stockbroker, James Eckersall, on the 21st of February. "I daily hear such reports of advantages to be gained by one project or another in the stocks, that my spirit is up with double zeal in the desire of our trying to enrich ourselves. I assure you, my own keeping a coach and six is not more in my head than the pleasure I shall take in seeing Mrs. Eckersall in her equipage. To be serious, I hope you have sold the lottery orders, that the want of ready money may be no longer an impediment to our buying in the stock, which was very unlucky at that time. I hear the South Sea fell since, and should be glad we were in. I also hear there is considerably to be got by subscribing to the new African stock. Pray let us do something or other, which you judge the fairest prospect. I am equal to what stock, so you do but like it. Let but fortune favour us, and the world will be sure to admire our prudence. If we fail, let's e'en keep the mishap to ourselves. But 'tis ignominious, in this age of hope and golden mountains, not to venture. I am very truly your ladies and sir your most obliged humble servant, A. Pope. A month later, with the South Sea stock at over 300, a debate took place in the House of Commons over the terms of the conversion. Several MPs, including Sir Robert Walpole, Sir Richard Steele, and Archibald Hutcheson, argued that the value of South Sea stock should be fixed in the terms for conversion. The Ministry opposed this measure for reasons that were not public knowledge. Several members of the Government and Court, including Chancellor Ailerby, Postmaster General James Craggs, Secretary to the Treasury Charles Stanhope, and the King's German mistresses, had been secretly provided with an allocation of shares in the South Sea Company by its directors. These shares were issued at a small premium to the prevailing market price, for which no deposit was required. As the shares did not in fact exist, the bribe functioned similarly to a modern executive stock options scheme. If the share price rose, the recipients could redeem the shares and take their profits. After receiving their fictitious shares or options, these influential persons had a keen interest in seeing the South Sea share price rise, regardless of the cost to the nation. The grasping Ailerby, who had also bought South Sea stock in the market, argued forcefully against Walpole and his confederates. On the 23rd of March 1720, the government's will prevailed, and the company was left free to set the terms of the conversion. The parliamentary debate on the conversion revealed a conundrum. All parties, government, company, annuitants, and existing shareholders, appeared to profit by the continuing rise in the South Sea stock. The circularity inherent in the scheme made a rational calculation of the shares' fair value difficult to compute. Some argued that the higher the shares rose, the more they were actually worth. This opinion was expressed by a correspondent in the Flying Post on the 9th of April, who claimed that the higher the price is which is given for the South Sea stock, the greater the benefit will the purchaser have thereby, and that at 300%, that is £300, it is intrinsically worth 448, and at 600 is worth 880. This plausible yet absurd calculation so enraged the financially minded Archibald Hutcheson, MP, that he published the first in a series of anti-South Sea pamphlets. Hutcheson maintained that people who bought surplus South Sea stock at its elevated price must be deprived of all common sense and understanding, since they would be giving their money away to the original stockholders and annuitants. Was there ever such a delusion from the beginning of the world to the 9th of April 1720 endeavoured to be imposed on the British nation? He asked. According to this way of computing, no person can purchase at too high a rate, since his profit will increase in proportion to the price he gives. Hutcheson saw clearly that the scheme was dependent on gulling both the annuitants into converting their securities into too few shares, and the purchasers of the money subscriptions, that is, those who bought the surplus South Sea shares from the company. After reminding his readers that Parliament was only committed to a 5% interest payment, and that the trading prospects of the company were not good, he concluded, "Certain it is that the loss at last must rest somewhere." In his periodical The Theatre, Sir Richard Steele made a similar point, warning that if this affair is not put upon the basis of trade, and that in a visible way of profit, with consideration of contingencies, a loss it will be, and is nothing but a great appearance, a bulky phantom. The Secret and Public History of the South Sea. Within the South Sea Company itself there were no such qualms. The company was under the control of a cabal led by John Blunt, ably assisted by the company cashier, Robert Knight. Blunt was a founding director of the company and the leading figure behind the conversion scheme. The son of a shoemaker, a Baptist by religion and a scrivener by trade, Blunt was a deeply unattractive character, described in a recent history of the South Sea bubble as burly and overbearing, glib, ingenious, and determined to get on. An insider account of his operations during 1720 is provided by an anonymous tract entitled The Secret History of the South Sea Scheme. According to its author, Blunt had one primary aim. "'Twas his avowed maxim, 1,000 times repeated, that the advancing by all means of the price of stock was the only way to promote the good of the company." He looked for 1,000 ways to attain this end. Originally, it had been planned that the company would sell any surplus shares after the conversion of annuities. Instead, Blunt decided to draw in the profit first. As soon as the South Sea Bill received royal assent on the 7th of April 1720, he offered a subscription of South Sea shares to the public. It was the first of the company's 4 money subscriptions during the year. On the 14th of April, £2 million of South Sea stock was offered to the public at 300 a share, that is, 3 times nominal value. The public was enthusiastic, and the subscription sold out within an hour. The launch of the money subscription before the conversion of annuities caused confusion to anyone attempting to calculate the intrinsic value of the stock, as no one could know what profits would derive from the conversion. This was intentional. According to the secret history, Blunt's second maxim was, "The more confusion, the better. People must not know what they do, which will make them the more eager to come into our measures. The execution of the scheme is our business. The eyes of all Europe are upon us." In order to make the money subscription attractive, Blunt offered easy terms for subscribers, as John Law had done with the Mississippi Company's share issues. This imitation was deliberate. Only a 20% deposit was required, the remainder to be paid in 8 instalments over the following 16 months. Again following John Law's example, the South Sea Company started providing loans to shareholders against the deposit of South Sea stock. Loans were made from proceeds of share sales, money coming in one door and going out the other, and from a £1 million loan which the government had provided the company. Their effect was to bolster the share price by both increasing the demand for stock, since with credit speculators could buy more shares, and reducing the supply of stock to the market, as mortgaged shares were retained by the company. The latter effect was reinforced when Blunt delayed delivering South Sea shares to annuitants who accepted the conversion. On the 30th of April, following a further issue of shares at 300, the company announced an increased dividend of 10%. The venal Blunt must have long anticipated this raise, since he had bought a call option on the midsummer dividend back in January. On the 28th of April 1720, the company opened its books for the first class of annuitants, known as the irredeemables, who rushed to subscribe, although the company had yet to provide them with the exact terms of conversion. In July, the subscription was extended to the other holders of government debt, the redeemables, again without the terms being presented. In the end, 80% of the irredeemables and 85% of the redeemables accepted the conversion. The holders of government debt who rushed blindly into the South Sea included such savvy professionals as the Bank of England and the Million Bank, an organization which held a number of government and company securities and operated like a modern investment trust. In the end, of the £31 million worth of government annuities that the company had offered to take over, £26 million was tendered in exchange for South Sea stock with a nominal value of only £8.5 million. This left the company with 175,000 surplus shares to sell to the public. Devil take the hindmost. Not everyone was convinced by the rise of the South Sea share price. On the 22nd of April 1720, the day after the company announced its willingness to make loans on stock, Thomas Guy, the miserly stationer who had amassed a fortune by buying sailors' tickets, credit notes issued by the Navy in lieu of pay, at steep discounts, began selling his holding of South Sea stock. Over the following 6 weeks, he sold shares with a nominal value of £54,000 for £234,000. Repenting a life of avarice, he later used some of the profits to endow the London hospital that bears his name. At around the same time, Sir Isaac Newton, the Master of the Mint, began selling his £7,000 holding of South Sea shares. When asked about the direction of the market, he is reported to have replied, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of the people." Richard Cantillon, the banker and economist, saw clearly that the bubble could not last indefinitely. Writing on the 29th of April 1720 to his client Lady Mary Herbert, he foresaw that the stock could be kept up for some time, perhaps some years, but a melancholy prospect for those who shall stay last. Adam Anderson, a former cashier of the South Sea Company, later claimed that many purchasers of shares in the South Sea and other promotions bought knowing that their long-term prospects were hopeless, since they aimed to get rid of them in the crowded alley to others more credulous than themselves. In May 1720, William King, the Archbishop of Dublin, also came to the conclusion that most that go into the South Sea matter are well aware it will not succeed, but hope to sell before the price falls. An anonymous pamphleteer expressed the situation for investors with great clarity. The additional rise of this stock above the true capital will be only imaginary. 1 added to 1 by any rules of vulgar arithmetic will never make 3.5. Consequently, all the fictitious value must be a loss to some persons or other, first or last. The only way to prevent it to oneself must be to sell out betimes, and so let the devil take the hindmost. The South Sea year was not one of calm calculation by investors pursuing an optimal strategy under the guiding light of rational expectations. As Edward Ward observed in his poem, A South Sea Ballad, "Few men who follow reason's rules grow fat with South Sea diet. Young rattles and unthinking fools are those that flourish by it." The inflated price of South Sea stock was not the most egregious example of investor irrationality. A number of new joint stock promotions had preceded the announcement of the South Sea scheme in January. Known as the bubble companies, these ventures appeared with increasing frequency during the summer months. Their method of flotation was simple. A notice appeared in a newspaper advertising a company and offering to take subscriptions at one of the number of coffee houses in the city. They served an extraordinary variety of purposes, ranging from financial services, such as Matthew West's Company for Buying and Selling South Sea Stock and all other public stocks, to overseas settlement, such as Captain Welby's Company of London Adventurers for the carrying on a trade to and settling colonies in Terra Australis. This latter venture a true speculation, since it was floated over half a century before Captain Cook discovered Australia. Several companies were founded on new technologies, including Puckle's Machine Gun and Sir Richard Steele's Fishpool Company, which was launched on a patent design for boats to bring live fish to the London market. For a while, the bubble companies flourished in the stock market. The two leading insurance bubbles, the Royal Exchange and the London Assurance, sold at their peak for 25 and 64 times paid-up capital respectively. Steele's Fishpool went to a premium of £160 before any call had been made on the shares. Globe Permits, giving the right to subscribe to a future sailcloth project, sold for £70 before the company had even been established. Shares in the older corporations also soared in the bull market. The East India went from 100 to a high of 445, the Royal Africa from 23 to 200, and Million Bank rose from 100 to 440. The total capitalisation of the London stock market rose to over £500 million at its peak in the summer of 1720, roughly 100 times the figure for 1695. It is observed, wrote the Weekly Packet of the 7th of May 1720, that many of these projects are so ridiculous and chimerical that it is hard to tell which is the most to be wondered at, the impudence of those that make the proposals, or the stupid folly of those that subscribe to them. Yet many a gudgeon hath been caught in the net, though one would think that with half an eye he might discern the cheat. Several of the bubble companies served rather bizarre purposes. One company was established to garner saltpetre by emptying all the necessary houses, that is to say lavatories, in England. Another promised to supply funerals across the country. The absurdity of these schemes and the credulity of investors produced tales of legendary companies that have subsequently found their way into the history books. The Bubbler's Mirror, a fly-sheet, playing on the themes of financial alchemy and investor irrationality, listed several real companies together with fabulous schemes for extracting silver from lead, for the transmutation of quicksilver, for building an engine to remove South Sea House to Moorfields, that is, the mental hospital commonly known as Bedlam, and for an air pump for the brain. Other schemes that most likely existed in legend rather than reality included companies for better curing venereal disease, for trading in human hair, and for a wheel for perpetual motion, by means of a wheel moving by force of its own weight. The most famous of the legendary bubble companies was that for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but no one to know what it is. The bubble legends, with their implied critique of corrupt projectors, financial alchemy, investor credulity, irrationality, and even madness, reveal in a parodic carnivalistic fashion the deep apprehensions that many contemporaries had about the speculative schemes. After the collapse of the bubble, they served as an admonition to future generations of speculators, taking their place along the earlier tulip legends. A recent historian of the South Sea bubble sympathetically interprets the bubble companies as attempts to realize a vision of material and technological progress ahead of their time. For better or worse, the machine gun was eventually perfected and Australia discovered. It is true that certain bubble companies, such as Steele's Fish Pool, were genuine, if flawed, promotions, but the great majority were fraudulent ventures designed to profit from the speculative euphoria. Their founders must have had little intention of creating legitimate enterprises. Only 4 of the 190 bubble companies founded in 1720 survived, although among them were 2 insurance companies, the Royal Exchange and London Assurance, which later flourished. Most bubble company projectors preyed on the credulity and cynicism of those who bought their shares. Speculators did not buy bubble company shares as long-term investments. They bought them with the intention of selling them on to greater fools. In a very short time, however, they were to discover that there were no greater fools in the market than themselves. Driven away from his anchorage. On the 15th of June 1720, the South Sea Company launched its 3rd money subscription, with no limit on the amount to be issued. 3 days earlier, Charles Stanhope, the Secretary to the Treasury, who had received Blunt's bribe of share options earlier in the year, secretly cashed in his shares for a profit of £249,000. This fabulous sum was paid directly out of the South Sea Company's treasury, and was nothing less than a fraud against the company's shareholders. On the very same day, Chancellor Ailerby attempted to persuade George I to sell his South Sea stock, but the king ignored this advice and sold only a few to raise cash to purchase more shares in the new subscription. Where the king led, the nation followed. South Sea stock worth £50 million was subscribed in a few hours, even though the price of the issue, at £1,000, was a third greater than the current market price of around £750. The incentive for subscribers was an easy payment scheme, which required only a 10% deposit, with the next instalment due in 1 year and others payable over 4 years. The money paid into the company was immediately lent against the deposit of stock, with over £3 million worth of credit provided to shareholders in 1 day. By the date of the 4th money subscription, on the 24th of August, the South Sea Company had issued shares with an initial market value of more than £75 million, and lent over £12 million against the deposit of stock. These operations reveal an extraordinary recklessness on the part of Blunt and his fellow directors. Chancellor Ailerby later claimed that events had run away from the company and the government. It became difficult to govern it, and let those gentlemen that opened the floodgates wonder at the deluge that ensued as much as they please, it was not in one man's power, or in the power of the whole administration, to stop it, considering how the world was borne away by the torrent. Yet Blunt and his fellow directors had deliberately opened the floodgates, and in the summer they displayed little desire to control the speculative torrent. Like the bubble itself, they had become inflated by the apparent success of the scheme and the glory that was showered upon them. According to the secret history, Blunt, surrounded by universal flattery, had become untouchable. He visibly affected a prophetic style, delivering his words with an emphasis and extraordinary vehemence, and used to put himself into a commanding posture, rebuking those that durst in the least oppose anything he said, and endeavouring to inculcate as if what he spoke was by impulse, uttering these and such-like expressions. "Gentlemen, don't be dismayed. You must act with firmness, with resolution, with courage. I tell you, 'tis not a common matter you have before you. The greatest thing in the world is referred to you. All the money of Europe will centre amongst you. All the nations on the earth will bring you tribute." Blunt's overblown messianic manner and his sense of boundless power, the secret history describes him as thinking himself no longer bound to keep any measures, he thought he had the world on a string, is a common defect of leading financiers during a speculative mania. John Law during the Mississippi bubble, George Hudson in the railway mania, Ivar Kreuger in the 1920s, and Michael Milken during the 1980s all displayed the same symptoms. The plans of the great financier may act as a catalyst to a speculative mania, but the financier himself does not remain untouched by events. His ambition becomes limitless. A chasm opens up between the public appearance of success and universal adulation on the one hand, and the private management of affairs, which become increasingly confused and even fraudulent. An insight into Blunt's behaviour is provided by Anthony Trollope, whose corrupt railroad financier Augustus Melmotte, in his novel The Way We Live Now, was partly inspired by George Hudson, the railway king of the 1840s. Describing Melmotte at the end of his career, Trollope claimed that insane ambition had driven him away from his anchorage. It can hardly be said of him that he had intended to play so high a game, but the game that he had intended to play had become thus high of its own accord. A man cannot always restrain his own doings and keep them within the limits which he had himself planned for them. They will very often fall short of the magnitude to which his ambition has aspired. They will sometimes soar higher than his own imagination. He had contemplated great things, but the things which he was achieving were beyond his contemplation. Blunt had projected the South Sea scheme with every intention of personal profit. He had bought options on the summer dividend, which he planned to increase. Seeing the success of the early money subscriptions, he had secretly increased the issue of shares to himself and his friends. He had done everything in his power to force up the price of the shares. When the shares were at their height, he sold out, and started to buy land with his profits. He even sold more shares than he owned, secure in the knowledge that the time would soon come when he could buy them back, cover his shorts, at a cheaper price. When the fourth and last money subscription was called in mid-August, realizing that the game did not have much longer to play, he instructed his fellow directors to purchase £3,000 worth of shares each, but only subscribed for £500 himself. If the South Sea scheme had been reasonably executed from the start, with a fixed value for the conversion of annuities into shares, as Sir Richard Steele and others demanded, and if Blunt had striven for less, been content with a share price of £150 rather than £1,000, limited his desire for personal enrichment, and kept his head when he became the hero of the nation, then there is little reason to doubt that the conversion would have proved useful to all parties. But Blunt's restless ambition destroyed any chance of success the scheme might have had. He was greedy and vain, and conducted his affairs with no more circumspection than the wildest speculator. Operations of financial alchemy, as Sir Isaac Newton discovered, were more likely to damage the mind of the alchemist than to achieve any lasting transmutation of base metals into gold. The South Sea Speculators. By summer, Alexander Pope had developed a rather confused attitude to the prevailing speculation. He was torn between a desire for personal profit and a disgust at the sordid money-grubbing of the nation. On the 24th of June, he wrote to his friend William Fortescue, "I am really piqued at the stocks, which put a stop at present to all trade and all friendship, and, I fear, all honour too." A week later he was less ill-humoured, writing to Fortescue that he and John Gay, the poet, intended to buy estates in Devonshire with their profits, and entertained thoughts of representing the county in Parliament. Shortly after, he received a pair of letters from Robert Digby on the South Sea, to which he replied, advising his friend to pay no attention to "this miserable mercenary period, and turn yourself, in a just contempt of these sons of mammon, to the contemplation of books, gardens, and marriage." Yet on the 22nd of August he wrote to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, warmly advising her to buy more stock. In his correspondence with Pope, Digby revealed how deeply the nation had immersed itself in the South Sea. "The London language and conversation is, I find, quite changed since I left it," wrote Digby, "though it is not above 3 to 4 months ago. No violent change in the natural world ever astonished a philosopher so much as this does me." From The Hague, the Mercure Historique et Politique reported in July, "The South Sea Company is continually a source of wonderment. The sole topic of conversation in England revolves around the shares of this company, which have produced vast fortunes for many people in such a short space of time. Moreover, it is to be noted that trade has completely slowed down, that more than 100 ships moored along the River Thames are for sale, and that the owners of capital prefer to speculate on shares than to work at their normal business." A few weeks earlier, Edward Harley, whose brother Robert, the former Tory minister, had established the South Sea Company back in 1711, observed that "the demon's stock-jobbing is the genius of this place. This fills all hearts, tongues, and thoughts, and nothing is so like bedlam as the present humour which has seized all parties, Whigs, Tories, Jacobites, Papists, and all sects. No one is satisfied with even exorbitant gains, but everyone thirsts for more, and all this is founded upon a machine of paper credit supported only by imagination." The same month, Jonathan Swift, whose own investments were being handled by John Gay, wrote in a letter, "I have inquired of some that have come from London, what is the religion there? They tell me it is South Sea stock. What is the policy of England? The answer is the same. What is the trade? South Sea still. And what is the business? Nothing but South Sea." The South Sea speculators came from every social class. At their head stood King George I, who had probably received an allocation of fictitious shares at the start of the scheme. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, also held South Sea shares, and was governor of the Welsh Copper Company, known commonly as the Prince of Wales's bubble. He was followed by an assortment of jobbing dukes, marquises, earls, and barons. Over 100 peers and 300 members of Parliament bought shares in the third money subscription. The roads thronged with country gentlemen and rich farmers coming to London to buy stock. City financiers were involved heavily in the early subscriptions, and foreign speculators, especially the Dutch, were prominent in Exchange Alley. By the time of the fourth money subscription, however, the domestic and international financiers suspected that the affair did not have much further to run. Many of the Dutch speculators sold up and repatriated their capital to invest in the booming Amsterdam stock market. The London bankers, for their part, simply refrained from partaking in the last subscription. The departure of the more experienced market operators at or near the peak of a bubble is a common feature of speculative booms. Blunt was well aware of this problem. In his insatiable desire to keep the share price rising, he declared a preference for making loans on stock not to professionals, but to ladies and young gentlemen who come from the other end of town with a spirit of gaming. For such, according to him, were the most likely to advance the price of the stock. Lady speculators. Women have played an important part in the history of speculation. Widows and orphans has long been the standard cry of those who seek to protect the innocent against the dangers of speculation. Charles Kindleberger has found a protective allusion to them dating back to Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC. The widow investor is deemed to be financially naive and in need of protection against charlatans. Her antithesis is the female speculator who first emerged in France and Britain in the early 18th century. In France, John Law was the object of relentless attention from ladies eager to receive shares in the Mississippi Company. The regent's mother observed lewdly that if duchesses were prepared to kiss Law's hand, what parts of his body might not other ladies favour? Chief among the aristocratic female speculators was the remarkable former nun Alexandrine de Tencin, mistress of the French chief minister Abbé Dubois, and possibly lover of John Law, and later mother of the philosophe d'Alembert, who established her own bureau d'agiotage. Another Mississippian, as they were called, was Lady Mary Herbert, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke, who later bought South Sea stock against the advice of her banker, Richard Cantillon. The extent of female speculation in the South Sea is revealed by the presence of 35 ladies, out of the 88 names, on Lord Sunderland's list for the second money subscription. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the celebrated traveller who introduced the smallpox vaccine to England, purchased South Sea stock in 1720, intending to use her profits to pay off a French blackmailer called Raymond, to whom she had written some indiscreet letters. Many of the ladies at the Princess of Wales's court in Richmond were active speculators, including the Duchesses of Rutland and Marlborough. Female speculation was also strong at the other end of the social spectrum. At Billingsgate, the conversation of the market women was said to turn to a merry way of buying and selling South Sea over a refreshing cup of gin. Ladies from the West End were reported to have rented a shop in the city, which they turned into a club for tea-drinking and playing the stock market. At leisure time, while their agents are abroad, they game for China. The Daily Post of the 20th of April 1720 announced that a new company had been floated, involving a proposal by several ladies and others to make, print, and paint and stain calicoes in England, and also fine linen, as fine as any Holland, to be made of British flax. They are resolved as one man to admit no man, but will themselves subscribe to a joint stock to carry on the said trade. Subscribers must be women dressed in calico. Subscription taken at the China shop in St. Martin's, near St. Paul's. In his South Sea ballad, Edward Ward described the visitors to Exchange Alley. Our greatest ladies hither come, and ply in chariots daily, oft pawn their jewels for a sum, to venture it in the alley. Young harlots, too, from Drury Lane, approach the change in coaches, to fool away the gold they gain by their obscene debauches. Women had various reasons to speculate. In 18th century England, most landed estates were in male entail, but there were no such restrictions on the ownership of shares. As ladies could not be seen to work for a living, they were attracted to the world of the stock market, in which matters of sex, class, and race were treated with extreme indifference. In 10 Years on Wall Street, 1870, William Fowler claimed that the female character was perfectly fitted to a life of speculation that derived its food from excitement, came from fancy, and required both patience and fortitude. Although speculation may have suited the feminine temperament, there is no reason to believe that lady speculators fared any better or worse than their male counterparts. The uncommonly astute Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, sold her South Sea stock in late May, clearing a profit of nearly £100,000. Others, such as Lady Mary Herbert and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, were not so prescient. Successful speculation, however, could reverse the inequality between the sexes. In early August 1720, in a letter to Appleby's Journal, a lady speculator declared her intention of purchasing a South Sea husband. "I am resolved to be even with the money-hunting sex, and if I lay out my money, to be sure of my possession." All for the better, or the world turned upside down. When these extraordinary events are considered, and women of the town are become dealers in the stocks, valets de chambre, footmen, and porters, as well as merchants, tradesmen, and pickpockets, walk on the exchange, and ride in their coaches, at the same time some good-natured gentlemen have quitted them, projectors successfully bubble the public in all their schemes, sharpers leave their gaming tables in Covent Garden for more profitable business in Jonathan's coffee-house, and even poets commence stock-jobbers, it is high time to pronounce Exchange Alley truly a farce. Speculation penetrated the barriers between the social classes. "We have seen," lamented Swift, "a great part of the nation's money got into the hands of those who by their birth, education, and merit could pretend no higher than to wear our liveries." The likes of Tom Double returned with a vengeance in the South Sea year. These ciphering cits, as Steele called them, impudently flaunted their new-found wealth, buying houses, coaches, and embroidered coats for themselves, and gold watches for their wives and mistresses. The rush to buy estates sent land prices soaring to 50 times their rental value. "Our South Sea equipages increase every day," observed Appleby's Journal in August. "The city ladies buy South Sea jewels, hire South Sea maids, and take new country South Sea houses. The gentlemen set up South Sea coaches, and buy South Sea estates." Conspicuous consumption was accompanied by revelry. At St. James's in late May, the King's birthday was celebrated with over 100 cases of claret, and the Duchess of Kendal appeared in a dress embroidered with jewels worth £5,000. In late July, great crowds of the nobility and gentry gathered at a house in Hampstead to divert themselves with nightly gambling and a weekly masquerade. The coffee-houses and taverns around the Exchange were packed with speculators indulging in bacchanalian excess. On Monday, the 22nd of August, when the subscription books for the fourth and last money subscription were opened, huge crowds gathered around South Sea House, and the entire issue of 10,000 shares, priced at £1,000 a share, was sold out by 1 o'clock. The historian John Carswell has described the atmosphere in the city. The town was on the point of being given over to the great annual carnival of Bartholomew Fair. Workmen were tearing up the paving stones of Smithfield to drive in the stakes for the stalls and show booths. The city was already full of freaks, fencers, play-actors, and mountebanks. As the week passed, the streets were choked day and night with a roaring mob, drinking, gambling, and gaping. On Wednesday, the 24th of August, the wedding of 2 vast, rich Jews, both of the name of Corney, was celebrated at the Leather Sellers' Hall in Bishopsgate, attended by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and the greatest concourse of the nobility that was ever known upon such an occasion. 200 dishes were served at the entertainment, and the public feasting continued for 3 days. Society, both high and low, was dancing to the frenetic beat of the stock market. A rude awakening. By midsummer, the directors of the South Sea Company were fearful that competition from bubble companies, which were appearing almost daily in Exchange Alley, would damage their company's share price. In order to monopolize the speculative enthusiasm, Blunt persuaded his friends in the government to pass the Bubble Act, which made illegal the establishment of companies without parliamentary permission, and prevented existing companies from carrying on activities not specified by their charters. The Act received royal assent on the 9th of June, the same day that John Blunt received a baronetcy, but it had little initial effect on the demand for bubble company shares, which remained strong. The South Sea directors were not to be outdone. They requested the Attorney General to issue a writ for prosecution, known as a scire facias, against 3 bubble companies which had diversified into areas not covered by their charters. 12 days later, the South Sea Company announced a dividend of 30% for the year, that is £30 on a £100 nominal share, and a guaranteed 50% dividend for the next 12 years. These 3 measures, the Bubble Act, the scire facias writ, and the enhanced dividend, were intended to sustain the flagging South Sea share price, which had peaked in late June at a price of £1,050, an 8-fold increase in under 6 months, but had fallen to £850 by August. To the horror of the directors, their machinations backfired. The publication of the scire facias brought panic to the stock market. Within a few weeks, York Buildings, a water company that had diversified outside its charter into property development, collapsed from 305 to 30. The leading insurance companies, the London Assurance and the Royal Exchange, fell by over 75%. Speculators who had purchased bubble company shares on credit were forced to sell their South Sea shares to make good their losses elsewhere. Even the company's announcement of a generous dividend failed to encourage investors, most of whom were more interested in capital gains. Besides, no one really believed that the company could afford to pay a 50% dividend. Other factors conspired to lower the South Sea share price. In June and July, foreigners began disposing of their South Sea shareholdings to reinvest their profits in the new bubble companies appearing in the Hamburg and Amsterdam stock markets. The canton of Bern, Switzerland, sold its South Sea stock and repatriated its profits. Speculation had also stretched domestic credit to its limits. Interest rates rose to over 20% in the summer, and neither the South Sea Company nor city bankers had any funds left to lend against South Sea stock. None of these factors proved decisive. In fact, no trigger for the collapse was needed. By late summer, the company had exhausted all available means of sustaining momentum in its share price, and without momentum, decline was inevitable. The month of September opened with the South Sea stock below 800. The decline accelerated in the second week, when the share price fell through a support level of 600, the price at which many bankers had provided loans against the deposit of stock. By the middle of the month, the South Sea directors gave up hope of staving off a collapse and started selling mortgaged stock with the intention of buying it back later at a lower price. A few days later, the Sword Blade Bank, which acted as banker to the South Sea Company and had made extensive loans against its stock, failed. By the end of September, the share price was below 200, a fall of around 75% in 4 weeks. At a meeting of the South Sea Company, a shareholder declared that with ruin so widespread, it had almost become unfashionable not to be bankrupt. On the 1st of October, Appleby's Journal reported that the sudden fall of our stocks, without visible reason, is the surprise of the world. The author went on to describe how the decline had occurred. The initial fall had brought a prodigious number of sellers to the market. One man selling alarms another and makes him sell, and thus the stock has run down insensibly, till all the people are put in a fright, and such has been the panic fear that it has brought great confusion along with it. In other words, the same feedback that had caused the bubble was working rapidly to deflate it. The violence of the collapse took most people by surprise. "I own I thought they would carry on their cheat somewhat longer," wrote James Milner, MP. "I said, indeed, that ruin must soon come upon us, but I own it came 2 months sooner than I expected." Alexander Pope, writing to Bishop Atterbury on the 23rd of September, had finally decided where he stood on the subject of the South Sea. Gone was the ebullient spectator of the new year, to be replaced by the autumnal moralist, intoning in classical style against the vices of the age. The fate of the South Sea scheme has much sooner than I expected verified what you told me. Most people thought it would come, but no man prepared for it. No man considered it would come like a thief in the night, exactly as it happens in the case of death. Methinks God has punished the avaricious as he often punishes sinners, in their own way, in the very sin itself. The thirst for gain was their crime, and that thirst continued became their punishment and ruin. As for the few who have the good fortune to remain with half of what they imagined they had, among whom is your humble servant, I would have them sensible of their felicity. They have dreamed out their dream, and awaking have found nothing in their hands. Indeed, the universal poverty, which is the consequence of universal avarice, and which will fall hardest upon the guiltless and the industrious part of mankind, is lamentable. The universal deluge of the South Sea, contrary to the old deluge, has drowned all except a few unrighteous men. But it is some comfort to me that I am not one of them, even though I were to survive and rule the world by it. Pope's metaphorical characterization of the speculative mania as a dream, in which people envisaged riches only to awaken and find them gone, was not unusual. Gibbon also called the South Sea a golden dream, and similar references can be found relating to the Mississippi bubble, the railway mania of 1845, the Souk al-Manakh boom in 1982, and the junk bond market of the 1980s. The dreaming speculator is seen as having surrendered both his reason and his wealth in the pursuit of phantom fortune. On awakening and realizing his losses, he is overcome with revulsion at his folly and avarice. We know, wrote Freud in this commentary on dream legends, that the gold the devil gives his paramours turns into excrement after his departure. The speculators' shame on awakening from their golden dreams was accompanied, as Pope suggests, by a sense that monetary losses were a sign of divine retribution, a punishment for the sin of mammonism. The distemper, reported Appleby's, has been a visitation. South Sea had been a judgment from heaven. Shall we not pity them whom God has smitten? In August, an outbreak of bubonic plague had occurred in Marseille, and slowly spread out across France, until it was feared that the plague would cross the Channel. The government ordered a day of humiliation to be observed, to beg of Almighty God to preserve these kingdoms from the infection. It was unnecessary to state which sins in particular required atonement. To some it appeared as if the plague had already landed. According to Defoe, the crowds outside South Sea House resembled walking ghosts, as if they were all infected with the plague. For never men looked so wretchedly. I shall remember a man with a South Sea face as long as I live. Losses on South Sea stocks were deemed to have driven men mad, an unhappy extension of the joyous irrationality earlier in the year, and there were exaggerated reports of suicides. In fact, Charles Blunt, a nephew of the South Sea director, had committed suicide in early September after sustaining losses in the stock market. Almost worse than suicide was the widespread destruction of business confidence. Defoe, who understood perfectly that trade, like credit and speculation, was dependent on confidence, penned an impassioned call for calm, reminiscent of Roosevelt's famous inaugural address in 1933, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Writing in Appleby's journal on the 17th of December 1720, he advised that the aftermath of the mania should be left to play itself out without interference. In a sick body, when the mass of blood is corrupted, when the constitution of the body is subverted, and the motion of the spirits stopped and stagnated, the patient finds no benefit by medicine. He must be left to nature, and to the secret operations of nature either for life or death. The body of South Sea people seemed to be in just such a crisis at this time. The distemper is strong upon them, they sink under it, and 'tis in vain to offer reason or arguments to them. The patient must be left to nature, and to the ordinary operations of his own demented understanding. Time would heal all wounds. The wild popular fury at the collapse of the South Sea scheme was without parallel in English history. Anger was directed primarily at the directors of the company, who had misled the people and profited personally by selling out before the collapse. Next came the politicians, who had secretly profited from Blunt's distribution of share options in the South Sea Company, and had subsequently allowed Blunt to bubble the people. A mob gathered at Westminster, demanding retribution and restoration. A secret committee was established by the Commons to investigate the dealings of directors. Remarkable scenes took place in the Commons, where Lord Molesworth, an Irish member, declared, "Extraordinary crimes call aloud for extraordinary remedies. The Roman lawgivers had not foreseen the possible existence of a parricide, but as soon as the first monster appeared, he was sewn in a sack and cast headlong in the river, and I shall be content to inflict the same treatment on the authors of our present ruin." The Secretary of State, James Craggs, whose father had been a recipient of Blunt's bribe, rose furiously in the Commons to offer satisfaction to anyone who cast aspersions on his honour. The 4 MP directors found themselves expelled from the House, and Chancellor Aislabie, along with several South Sea directors, was sent to the Tower. A bill was passed by Parliament to confiscate the profits that South Sea Company directors had made during 1720. It raised over £2 million, including £96,000 from the estate of Edward Gibbon, whose grandson, the historian, deplored this retroactive statute as a pernicious violation of liberty. By the rules of jurisprudence, Gibbon was correct, but the public demanded a scapegoat more substantial than a carnival effigy. Legislation in the aftermath of the South Sea bubble did not end with the South Sea Sufferers Act. In December 1720, a bill had been proposed for the better establishment of public credit by preventing for the future the infamous practice of stock jobbing. It was shelved. 14 years later, Parliament passed a measure known after its sponsor as Sir John Barnard's Act, which made illegal short sales and the trade in futures and options. It was to remain on the statute book until the middle of the 19th century. A rational bubble. Some speculators lost fabulous sums. Sir Justus Beck, a director of the Bank of England, went bankrupt for £347,000, and the Duke of Chandos surrendered £700,000 of his paper fortune. Sir Isaac Newton lost £20,000 by selling out too early and then re-entering the market at its peak. He is said to have blanched at any mention of the South Sea for the remainder of his life. The men of letters who had dabbled in the stock market also suffered. Addison's nephew, Eustace Budgell, who a few years earlier had penned an article in The Spectator entitled "The Art of Growing Rich," suffered severe losses, which led eventually to his suicide. Having followed the advice of her friend Alexander Pope, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu failed to sell out at the top of the market and continued to be blackmailed by Raymond for several years. A myth has grown up around the losses of John Gay, who had gambled away his advance for a book of poems, and now bewailed his speculative foray in verse. Why did Change Alley waste thy precious hours among the fools who gaped for golden showers? No wonder if we found some poets there who live on fancy and can feed on air. No wonder they were caught by South Sea schemes, who ne'er enjoyed a guinea but in dreams. Despite the loud lamentations of the losers, the depression which followed the collapse of the South Sea bubble was neither long nor deep. Merchants' losses were limited, probably because as a group they had avoided the fourth money subscription and sold out before the crash. Although South Sea stock fell to 15% of its peak, and Bank of England and East India shares fell by near 2/3, the number of mercantile bankruptcies in 1721 did not increase significantly from the previous year, and the economy recovered quickly. Adam Smith, in his Lectures on Jurisprudence, was rather dismissive of the whole South Sea episode as being of little consequence, a pale imitation of the Mississippi bubble that turned out at last a mere fraud. This judgment is not quite fair. The South Sea scheme was not simply a copy of the Mississippi system. Imitation existed on both sides of the Channel. In his conversion of the French national debt into company shares, John Law had borrowed from the example of existing English companies, including the South Sea Company. His initial success led the South Sea directors to attempt a more ambitious conversion than had ever been attempted in England. More important than imitation, the proximity of the two great bubbles showed how the contagion of speculation might pass from one country to another, in this case not just from France to England, but throughout Europe to Amsterdam, Hamburg, and even Lisbon. There were more profound consequences to the events of 1720 than Adam Smith acknowledged. When he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the Bubble Act, which hindered the foundation of companies by requiring that each receive its own Act of Parliament, and Sir John Barnard's Act, which outlawed many of the techniques of speculation, were still on the statute book. As a result, the progress of financial capitalism in the 18th century was retarded, and joint stock companies contributed less than they might otherwise have done to Britain's industrial revolution, although other types of organisation, such as mutual companies, thrived in their place. The general revulsion against companies and speculation that followed the events of 1720 is evident in Smith's own work. He considered the joint stock company to suffer fatally from the separation of management from ownership, what modern economists refer to as the agency problem. Negligence and profusion, he concluded, must always prevail, more or less, in the management of the affairs of such a company. As a result, Smith did not develop a theory of speculation. Any interpretation of the bubble of 1720 which neglects the role of the government is severely limited. The South Sea Company systematically bribed both the court and Parliament. Part of this bribe was overt, the £7.5 million for converting the annuities, and part covert, in the form of illegal share options granted to courtiers and ministers. Later, Blunt gave parliamentarians the first opportunity to get their names on the lists of the money subscriptions, and many invested heavily for themselves and their friends. Because they stood to profit twice from the rising share price, few politicians heeded the eminently sensible demand for fixing the rate of conversion of annuities into South Sea stock. Instead, Chancellor Aislabie, a man described by another MP as dark, and of a cunning that rendered him suspected and low in all men's opinions, and much set upon increasing his fortune, persuaded Parliament to allow the company to set its own terms for the conversion. There is no reason to doubt that Aislabie and others in the executive knew that the company would do everything possible to inflate the share price, even at the expense of the annuitants. Archibald Hutcheson asked Parliament whether it was not the duty of a British Senate to take all necessary precautions to prevent the ruin of many thousands of families. His question fell on ears that were not disinterested, and it was therefore ignored. The British government in 1720 not only abdicated its responsibility to protect its existing creditors, its support for the scheme sent out the message to speculators that South Sea shares were a sure thing. If the king was prepared to invest in the third money subscription at a price of £1,000, it appeared safe for his subjects to do likewise. The belief that the government would support the share price above its intrinsic value was not a singular occurrence. As we shall see, it recurred in Japan in the 1980s, when it was argued that the Ministry of Finance would not allow share prices to fall. The government's failure to protect the nation from the pitfalls of speculation was the single most important lesson to come out of the calamitous events of the South Sea. Adam Anderson, a former cashier of the South Sea Company, hoped that the year 1720 may serve for a perpetual memento to the legislators and ministers of our own nation, never to leave it in the power of any hereafter to hoodwink mankind into so shameful and baneful an imposition on the credulity of the people, thereby diverted from their lawful industry. Joseph Schumpeter identified the events of 1720 with the financial innovations over the previous 30 years. The mania of 1719–20 was, exactly as were later manias of this kind, induced by a preceding period of innovation which transformed the economic structure and upset the pre-existing state of things. Recently, this interpretation has been refined by an American economist, Larry Neal, in whose view the bubble was less a tale about the perpetual folly of mankind and more one about financial markets' difficulties in adjusting to an array of innovations. The essence of the South Sea scheme was the offer to convert illiquid government annuities into marketable joint stock shares. For Neal, it was this conversion process that produced the bubble. The South Sea bubble should be viewed not simply as a wild mania or as a massive swindle, he concludes. These played a role, but the driving force in the bubble was the technical problem of converting government war debts into easy-to-exchange, low-interest, long-term securities. Neal argues that the rise of the South Sea share price during the early phases of the scheme reflected the fact that investors were prepared to pay a premium for converting annuities, which were expensive and difficult to transfer, into the more liquid South Sea stock. By late May 1720, according to Neal, a rational bubble set in, as investors realized that the directors were manipulating the stock upwards, and they had nothing to lose by following the trend. The bubble finally came crashing down because the directors overreached themselves, and the company could not meet its commitments. There are several reasons for rejecting this thesis. The liquidity premium for the conversion of annuities into joint stock shares cannot have been that great, as investors who wanted marketable securities before 1720 were not obliged to hold annuities. They could buy stock in the Bank of England, the Million Bank, or any of the other chartered companies. The South Sea conversion of 1720 was not the first time that government debt had been converted into corporate stock. The Bank of England had engrafted government debt into its own shares in 1697, and the South Sea Company had done the same on two previous occasions, in 1711 and 1719. In the first two of the three South Sea conversions, the engraftment had actually led to a fall in the price of shares below their nominal level. Despite its grandiose title, the South Sea Company had no genuine prospects of a profitable trade with South America. The value of its shares was derived entirely from the income the company received from the government. It is therefore possible to calculate with an unusual degree of precision how much the South Sea shares were intrinsically worth, as is not the case with most companies whose future earnings are to a great extent indeterminate. In the spring of 1720, Archibald Hutcheson and Richard Steele argued that, given the fixed income the company received from the government, the fair value of South Sea stock was around £150. They concluded that any rise above this level would lead to a loss for both the annuitants and subscribers of South Sea stock. As the South Sea stock fell back to its fair value in the autumn of 1720, their opinion was vindicated. If investors chose not to heed the warnings of Hutcheson and Steele, and preferred to convince themselves that there was no limit to the potential price for South Sea stock, it was because they chose to act irrationally in pursuit of short-term gains. A vast amount of contemporary documentation relates to the irrationality of investors in the South Sea year. According to the Dutch banker Crelius, Exchange Alley in April 1720 resembled nothing so much as if all the lunatics had escaped out of the madhouse at once. Neal's account of the South Sea bubble, like Garber's version of the tulip mania, is intended to bolster the modern theory of efficient markets and rational investors. In its most extreme form, this theory denies the possibility of irrationality in speculative bubbles, and claims that investors are acting rationally even when they purchase shares above fair market value, in the expectation that the price will continue to rise, at least in the short run. A rational investor is one who seeks to optimize his wealth by offsetting risk with reward and using all publicly available information. Was the investor who bought South Sea stock at £1,000 behaving rationally? The answer is no. First, there was sufficient public information to suggest that the share price was severely overvalued. Second, by entering the bubble at an advanced state, the investor faced a poor ratio of risk to reward. He was chasing a small potential gain and risking a larger and more certain loss. Third, the fundamentals, that is, the long-term prospects of the company, did not change significantly in the year. As its future income remained fixed, there was no reasonable cause for its share price to exhibit such extreme volatility. The theory of the rational bubble appears to be nothing more than an elaborate restatement of the greater fool investment strategy, whereby the speculator knowingly buys shares above their intrinsic value, hoping that a greater fool will pay more for them later. The exponents of the rational bubble appear to overlook the fact that the success of this strategy is dependent on liquidity, that is, the constant presence of both buyers and sellers in the market, and that, in a panic, buyers vanish at the very moment when rational bubble speculators are seeking to unload their shares. The greater fool method of investment has enjoyed great popularity in the 1990s American bull market, where it has been renamed momentum investing. Speculators look to buy shares that are rising faster than the market and sell quickly when the rise begins to peter out. The fate of the London banker John Martin in 1720 illustrates the dangers of this frivolous approach to investment. Early in the summer, he had gleefully argued that, when the rest of the world is mad, we must imitate them in some measure. But he failed to sell out before the crash, lost a fortune, and ended up complaining pathetically of being blinded by other people's advice. Chapter 4. Fool's Gold, the Emerging Markets of the 1820s. Her husband broke his heart in— How did you say her husband broke his heart, my dear? In pumping water out of the Peruvian mines, replied Miss Tox. Not being a pumper himself, of course, said Mrs. Chick, glancing at her brother. And it really did seem necessary to offer the explanation, for Miss Tox had spoken of him as if he had died at the handle. But having invested money in the speculation, which failed. Charles Dickens, Dombey and Son, 1846. In late 1821, His Highness Gregor, Cacique of Poyais, a small territory on the border of present-day Nicaragua, arrived in London. His intention was to sell land rights, military commissions, and titles of nobility to British subjects, and to encourage emigration to his country. Finding a growing appetite for foreign loans in the city, the cacique arranged to float a £600,000 Poyasian loan with a 6% dividend through the offices of Sir John Perring, a former Lord Mayor of London. The issue was a tremendous success, and the bonds soared to an early premium in the market, although some suggested this was mainly the result of dubious manipulation on the exchange. Early in 1823, 200 colonists, including a bank manager, a jeweller, a cabinet maker, and a gentleman's servant, were sent out to the Poyasian capital, St. Joseph. Instead of the opulent Baroque city promised by the cacique, they found a collection of mud huts surrounded by swamps and threatening Indians. Suffering from heat, starvation, and fever, several of the colonists drowned while attempting to flee to neighbouring Belize. A Scottish cobbler, who had been appointed official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, shot himself. Of the 200 colonists, only 50 succeeded in returning to Britain. By this time, the cacique, whose real name was Sir Gregor MacGregor, a Scottish adventurer and renegade general from Simón Bolívar's army, who laid claim to his kingdom after a drunken deal with the chief of the Mosquito Indians, had fled to France with his family, taking with him the proceeds of the bond issue. Hope springs eternal in the financial markets, and half a century later, Poyasian land grants and debt certificates were still to be found in the bulging wallets of the alleymen of the stock exchange, along with the bonds and shares of busted companies. To this day, the Poyet loan remains the only loan for a fictitious country to be floated on the London Stock Exchange. Speculation and government loans. British government bonds, known as consols, named after the consolidation of government loans in the 1750s, replaced shares as the primary object of speculation after the events of 1720. As the speculative spirit abhors government regulations, various ways were found to get round the restrictions on futures and options enshrined in Sir John Barnard's Act of 1734. Settlement for a distant account day became an alternative to an illegal futures transaction. Quarterly settlement became regular in the 1730s, replaced by 6-week account periods in the 1780s. Bull operators could sell on settlement days, when they were due to pay for their stock, and repurchase almost simultaneously for the new account period, a process known as backwardation. Loans for speculators in government stock were also commonly available. Often the law was simply ignored. On the stock exchange, dealing in options continued unabated. Although options contracts were unenforceable at law, the broker's pledge, "My word is my bond," was deemed sufficient. In 1821, a broker complained that the options trade was now so frequent as to constitute the greater part of the business done in the house. But a committee of the stock exchange backed away from banning the business after several brokers threatened to establish a rival exchange. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British government issued over £400 million of bonds. Fortunes were made speculating in these issues. The broker David Ricardo amassed over £500,000 before retiring early to pursue a second career as an economist and Member of Parliament. Ricardo is credited with formulating the golden rules of speculation: cut short your losses and let your profits run on. The decline of British government borrowing after peace with France forced investors to look abroad for opportunities. The French reparation loan of 1817, arranged by Baring Brothers, produced a quick capital gain for British investors and whetted their appetite for more foreign loans. The next year, Nathan Rothschild launched a £5 million loan for Prussia, the first foreign bond denominated in sterling, and an antecedent of the modern Eurobond market. Soon after, Rothschild was asked by a Commons committee whether the growing passion for foreign stocks was a sign of investment or speculation. "Half and half," he replied, but when a price rise took place, all purchases became speculative. Among the foreign loans offered to the British public, a more romantic object appeared: the South American bond. For several years, various provinces of South America had been fighting for independence under the inspirational leadership of Simón Bolívar. British support for the liberation movement was strong, stemming from ancient prejudices against Spain, the old Catholic enemy, and a more modern liberal enthusiasm for independence. After the expulsion of the Spaniards, rapid economic progress was anticipated for the continent. "We may indulge the brightest hopes of these southern republics," proclaimed the New Times. "They have entered upon a career of endless improvement, and will soon attain the knowledge and freedom and civilization of the happiest states of Europe." British technology and arts would assist this process of modernization. The proposition was enticing, and with a declining supply of consols available, the investing public became ensnared in the first emerging market boom. In March 1822, Bolívar's envoy for the new Republic of Colombia arranged a £2 million loan with the city merchants Herring, Graham and Powell's. A prospectus was issued, alluding to Colombia's unbounded resources and plentiful mines. Intricate bond certificates were engraved by London's leading printer, and their interest payments were set at over 7%, double the return on consols. Other Latin American states were quick to exploit the opportunity. 2 months later, a subscription for a Chilean loan was launched, which entitled the bearer to purchase 5 £100 bonds for only 10% down. These loans met with immediate success. By the middle of October, the value of the Chilean bonds had risen over a quarter, a profit of more than 150% to the purchasers of scrip, short for subscription. This was the name given to partly paid shares or bonds. The demand for a Peruvian loan was so great that a near riot broke out at the Royal Exchange. If the very respectable Mr. Lemuel Gulliver were to appear on stage again, remarked the New Times, and to issue proposals for a loan to the Republic of Laputa, he would run hazard of being suffocated by the pressure of subscribers to set down their names. The paper proved remarkably prescient, as shortly after the Poyet loan came to the market. Euphoria for foreign loans was not confined to South America. The public's enthusiasm for the Greek struggle against Turkey was even stronger. In late February 1824, a banquet was hosted by the Lord Mayor of London at the Guildhall to launch a Greek loan. A shady city character, named Herman Hendricks, was appointed agent for the rebel Greek government. The heavily oversubscribed loan, £800,000 at 6%, was issued amid great excitement, and the proceeds were sent to a committee of English Philhellenes in Greece, of which Lord Byron was a member. A few months earlier, a prospectus had circulated in the city to raise funds for the Order of St. John of Jerusalem in order to expel the Turks from the island of Rhodes. However, this curious attempt to launch a medieval crusade with modern finance attracted insufficient interest from investors, and the loan was withdrawn. As well as appealing to liberal sentiments, the foreign loans were designed to be attractive to investors. Their interest payments were set so high that the South American bonds had to be contracted in Paris to avoid British usury laws, which limited interest charges to a maximum of 5%, an early example of offshore finance being used to evade government regulations. The market yield of the bonds was even higher, since they were issued at steep discounts to their nominal value. Moreover, only small initial deposits were required, with further payments stretched over a lengthy period. Thus, a small percentage rise in the market value of the bonds brought far greater returns to the holders of scrip. A large percentage of the money raised by the loans was retained by British contractors to pay dividends, while the proceeds from later loan issues were used to repay earlier debts. The payment of interest from capital, otherwise known as Ponzi finance, created the illusion of viability, although no money was ever actually sent from South America to service the loans, to which it must be added that the borrowing countries received only a tiny fraction of the total sums for which they contracted. The South American mining mania. Investors were not prepared to accept this state of affairs indefinitely. They expected the South American states to find the money to service the loans once their economies had recovered from the turmoil of the independence wars. The prospectuses asserted that the loans were backed by the abundant gold resources of the continent. The output of the Latin American gold mines had been severely disrupted by the wars. In early 1822, J.D. Powell's, one of the Colombian loan contractors, established a joint stock mining company to restore gold production. In no time, new South American mining companies replaced foreign loans as the favoured object of speculation. British capital and modern mining techniques, it was hoped, would exploit the mineral resources of South America with greater efficiency than the backward Spanish had ever attained. "Will not the probability be," inquired a jingoistic shareholder in a letter to John Bull, "that these things may be much better performed by Englishmen, who so well understand the use of machinery, than by Spaniards, who are comparatively ignorant of its application?" Posed to the inhabitants of the world's greatest industrial power, the question required no answer. The promoters of the South American mining companies larded their prospectuses with fabulous tales. One prospectus declared that lumps of pure gold weighing from 2 to 50 pounds were totally neglected, and that the company's mines would yield considerably more than the quantity necessary for the supply of the whole world. The prospectus of the Rio Plata Mining Association claimed that within the area of the company's concession, grains of gold appear in sight when the rain washes away the dust which covers the surface. After a very heavy rain, a woman stepping forth from her hut, a few yards from the door, found a piece of gold weighing 20 ounces. These instances happen so frequently that it would require much time to detail them. The claim that the mines would produce more gold than Europe required was taken seriously. It was feared that the great inflation brought by South American gold in the 16th century would return, and some people, according to the Russia merchant Thomas Took in his History of Prices, believed and acted upon the belief of a diminished value of gold and silver in consequence of the vast additional quantity